So good afternoon to you all. My name is Dr. Gergely Varga. I'm a senior research fellow and program manager at the Institute of Foreign Affairs and Trade in Budapest. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to today's IFAT webinar, War in Space, Strategy, Space Power, Geopolitics, More Space for NATO and for the EU. I think we really have quite interesting and ambitious webinar ahead of us. I wonder, and I'm pretty sure that some of you might remember the 1980s, 1990s TV series Star Trek, where in the opening line there was a reference on the ambition of the spaceship traveling through outer space, saying that the main aim of this ship is to boldly go where no man has ever gone before. Well, our aim, our ambition for today is to boldly go where few international relations think tanks in the region, I believe, have gone before, which is exploring the geopolitical, the implications of space power and the growing significance of space in geopolitics, in strategic competition, not just among great powers, but among countries throughout the world. Today we have someone who is excellently positioned and able of grabbing the most interesting and most important implications for the growing significance of space from a geopolitical perspective. So I'm really delighted to welcome Dr. Bleddyn Bowen with us for today. He's a lecturer in international relations at the University of Leicester, but he is also author of the book War in Space, Strategy, Space Power, Geopolitics. It's an excellent work on excellent and original, compelling work on the theory of space power, which with a focus on the conduct of military force and space technology and its implications on geopolitics. The work received excellent reviews. This work has only appeared this summer, so it's quite new. And we have here today Dr. Bowen to basically in the first half an hour to give us a little bit of insight into the main research findings of this work, also from the perspective of the implications for the European Union and NATO. What would be the main takeaways from his work for these organizations, but also maybe perhaps looking from a Central European perspectives, the main implications for smaller European states such as Hungary or other countries in the region. So with this, I would give the floor now to Dr. Bowen. Thank you again for being with us today.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and thanks for the welcome and for having me on here today, and thanks for the kind comments on the book as well. So I'm just going to share some slides now, hopefully, which should work. I hope you can see the slides. Okay, right, so for the next hopefully half an hour or so, I'll be talking to you about mostly the arguments based on my book and the research which I've been doing for many years now in international relations and strategy in outer space, and I'll be finishing off with some thoughts and implications for NATO, the European Union, and possibly small states as well. Space is for everyone, not just the rocket scientist and not just for the big powers of the international system. So hopefully now you can see my second slide. On argument, thank you. Okay, so the arguments that I'm going to be giving to you today is to begin by saying that space power in the international system is increasingly multipolar. So any of you familiar with international relations will be fairly familiar with the idea of the unipolar moment, or the United States as the hegemon of the international system since the end of the Cold War. And in space, I think today it's fair to describe outer space as perhaps something resembling more multipolarity, or at least not unipolarity, when there are many other powers that are capable in space in their own right. They are fairly autonomous actors in space and aren't overly reliant on the United States for essential capabilities. So the United States can't really override the will or the wishes of other states in the international system, as terms like unipolarity or hegemony seems to imply. I think they're too strong a word for American power in space. I would say that, especially in terms of the military and economic dimensions. Related to that, and in recent years with the establishment of the US Space Force, space dominance can't be assumed. It's a useful concept or an aspiration for military forces to have. If you're in a war, then you want to be able to dominate any particular environment that is useful to you. That's a fairly generic and standard assumption or aspiration that military forces make. Space is no different in that regard. And some people get unduly alarmed by the language used by American military doctrine, or even the US president, when they talk about space dominance. They usually talk about it in the way that the US Navy will talk about naval dominance. It's about dominating a medium for a certain amount of time in a time of war. It's not about stopping other states from using the space environment in otherwise conditions of peace, or relatively low hostile actions. So space dominance itself is something that can't be assumed. So even if a major war was to happen, space dominance is not just something that happens. It has to be worked for, fought for, and there will be other powers that will try to deny space dominance towards their adversaries. So like aerial and naval dominance, it will be contested. So it's not an automatic or assumed thing. Power is distributed, and dominance is not something that can be assumed. Space power itself, or the use of space technology, is mostly about being in a supporting role in modern warfare. Space is mostly about logistics and support services. It's not Star Trek, it's not Star Wars, it's not James Bond with Moonraker, or Diamonds Are Forever, not super weapons in space, nothing like that. It's about the logistics, support services, the data that satellites gather or coordinate or transport around the world, the web of connectivity that satellites provide. And these provide support services for terrestrial military forces. Space power makes terrestrial military forces better at what they do and more able to do modern warfare operations. So space warfare is about denying and securing those supporting services from space, not about blowing things up for their own, for its own sake. Also, contrary to much language in various think tank analyses and armchair strategists on the blogosphere these days, wars may not begin in space. They may do, it's a possibility, but they may not begin in space as well. The first major strikes in a future war, they may not happen in space, but some people are saying space is where the enemy will hit first. Well, maybe that's a possibility. We don't know. There are many reasons to not strike first in space, depending on the particular war that you're dealing with. Also, wars may not be decided by what goes on in space as well. Many people are also saying future wars will be determined by who wins the space war. Well, not necessarily. It's a bit more complicated than that, and a lot of my book is about trying to explain that grey area of how decisive space is. And in true academic fashion, the answer is it depends. It depends on a lot of factors as to whether space will be influential or not in the outcome of a war on the whole. The if there's one thing that hopefully readers take from the book, those who can manage to get through it all, is the analogy that Earth orbit is like a coastal environment. Many people treat outer space as a new ocean or something like blue water oceanic maritime strategy. I make the argument that Earth orbit, at least, is like a coastal environment. And unlike open oceans, coastlines are more accessible. They are populated by more actors, and you can project influence and effects and weapons capabilities into outer space from Earth, just like continental powers can project influence into coastal waters from the land. They don't need big navies to effectively deal with blue water navies, for example. So there are lots of parallels with looking at outer space as an adjacent, flanking or littoral nearby environment like a coastline, rather than an ocean, which tends to be far away, only really within the reach of the biggest powers in terms of naval combat capabilities, and is quite isolated from where states actually live and where they are preoccupied with. Towards the end of the presentation, I'll be talking about how the European Union is slowly but surely becoming more of a hard space power, it's providing more military-grade space backbones for its member states and becoming an alternative to the United States. So the EU is becoming a source of high-end military space capabilities that rivals the United States, or as a backup to the United States in many cases. Small states, as a result, have more forum shopping opportunities. If you want to do more stuff in space these days, you don't have to go to the United States. You don't necessarily have to go through the European Space Agency or the European Union either. Many other states are doing a lot more stuff in space now, and there's a lot more forum shopping available for small states and whatever it is they want to do in space as well, especially in terms of launch services. In terms of the future relationship between the European Union and the European Space Agency, things are a little bit in flux at the moment, especially in the context of Brexit and that impact on the ESA-EU relationship. And I'll be talking a little bit about what to look out for in that in the decade to come as well. So before getting into any more detail, it's worth spelling out what exactly is space power. For many people, this is a new subject. And I define space power as a diverse collection of activities and technologies in space, or to do with outer space. It's a concept defined by how any actor can use outer space and what it possesses, or can effectively call upon to enable it to do so. It's a range of technologies and activities in space, and they are usually deployed for the purposes of warfare, economic development, and prestige. So there are lots of different kinds of space technologies that come under the umbrella term of space power. I like to organize them in terms of whether they are mostly for military security and intelligence purposes, war. Are they more for infrastructure and economic development? And then are they then also playing a prestige or techno-nationalist or propagandistic role as well? And most space systems fit into one or several of these categories at the same time. And so that's the introduction I give to my students at the University of Leicester anyway, to just get them started on how to think about what all those machines in space are actually doing. In many ways, this is a conceptual equivalent to sea power and air power as well. So aerial and naval technologies and the way we use these environments for economic and prestige purposes as well is very similar to space and vice versa. So to give everyone a bit of background and context as well, since the end of the Cold War, there's been a growth in the space activities of many other states, whilst Europe, Japan, India, and China have had long-running space programs and space capabilities from the Cold War. It was only after 1991 that these activities really took off in terms of the amount of satellites launched and the range of technological capabilities that they had in space as well. Now, today, you have a lot more actors paying these same states to launch their things into space, to launch their satellites into space. Countries like Nigeria, for example, they are operating and own a lot of their own satellites for Earth observation and terrestrial development planning, but they pay other states to launch their satellites for them. And they also contract companies in the UK, for example, to build the satellites, but then the Nigerians operate it themselves for their own purposes. So there's a lot of opportunities now for smaller states to either to basically pay or buy any services that they can't do themselves and get what they want from it. So you could pay for an entire service, or you can pay for sections of a space system if you can't afford to do them yourself. So the increasing spread of space power to more and more states means that smaller states have more opportunities to do what it is they want that's within their budgets, within into space power as well. And even though launches in that graph there, they don't tell you everything about space and the distribution of space power, it just shows a pace of activity, and it shows how the increasing democratization of space is definitely an upward trend for the past 30, 40 years or so. And even during the Cold War, the military and economic activities in outer space were not restricted to the Soviet Union and the United States. Already you had other states doing important stuff in space in military and economic terms in the 1970s and the 1980s, including, of course, India, which led the way in a lot of remote sensing and its use in infrastructure development. So with that general context and the ability of many states to put satellites into space or pay other states to put their satellites into space, there's something resembling perhaps more multipolarity, or at least not unipolarity. Some might argue it's more of a bipolar system if you look at the United States and China, but it is more multipolar. And multiple space powers can attract and develop the capabilities of others and try and compete for investments of many states in space for the benefit of their own space industries as well. And this is part of a long-term trend as well. This is not just something new for the post-Cold War era, but is definitely increasing as time goes on. There's a lot of noise about new space, or space 4.0, as the European Space Agency likes to call it, which emphasizes the role of the commercial sector. Whilst there is more commercial activity in space right now, that's not entirely new. Commercial communication satellites go back to the 1980s, but also the role of the state is still very, very important in space. The most reputable analyses of the global space economy still show how most of the space economy around the world is still reliant on government contracts, public spending, and space infrastructure that is paid for by the state and taxation. So whilst there is more commercial activities going on in space, it doesn't mean that the state is not important. The state still underwrites the global space economy, and the US government in particular is still a massive driving force in creating that space economy, which is not fully marketized. It's still highly dependent on public spending. A difficult question to answer as well is, how do you measure space power? How do you actually tell who's got what in space? And this is a very difficult question, one I also pose to my students at Leicester. And one way to do so is to count the physical assets that are in space. And from the January 2020 Union of Concerned Scientists satellite database, these are the figures. They've gone up a little bit since then from the August catalogue, but I haven't had time to update this since August. But it gives you a general sense for the distribution of capabilities. The United States still has the largest number of satellites, but China is in a very comfortable second place numerically. Russia now in third. Russia used to be second once upon a time, but now China's really taken off compared to Russia, which has been busy modernizing and reconstituting what it lost in the 1990s after the collapse of the Soviet Union. But if you look at the other there as well, the other shows how many satellites are held by other states as well, including commercial satellites that are registered within those states. Numbers don't tell you everything, of course. Numbers are quite a crude measurement, but this is just a snapshot just to give you an idea. So what I've got on the right there is an attempt to try and highlight perhaps more useful numbers, as opposed to sort of the headline counts on the left of that slide. And what I've highlighted there in bold are the kinds of capabilities that are still fairly restricted to a low number of states. These are sort of the more strategically essential space technologies and capabilities. So hard kill anti-satellite weapon systems, so missiles that would carry ramming vehicles or explosive warheads on them to destroy a satellite. It's only 4 states that have any significant or proven capabilities in that regard. Russia's not done a intercept test, but they have done many flight tests recently on that. India, of course, in 2019 improved with an intercept test. China famously did so in 2007, the United States in 2008, and there have been many other flight tests that had no kinetic impact event as well since then. GNSS, Global Navigation Satellite Systems, so systems like GPS, Galileo, Beidou, GLONASS, the navigation technologies, those global navigation systems are still only dispersed among 4 states. So that's still a fairly exclusive technology because they are complex and expensive to develop and usually take a long time as well. The Galileo program started almost 20 years ago, and so did the Chinese Beidou. PNT states, precision, navigation and timing states. So other kinds of navigation technologies, a little bit more dispersed. So Japan, India and Australia. Japan and India do have regional navigation systems designed to enhance things like GPS for civilian use. Australia is looking at doing a similar augmentation system as well. So that's sort of a more accessible navigation system technology, but it's not the same as GNSS, which has clear military utility. So you have heavy lift launch capabilities, so the heaviest rockets that can put the biggest, most complex satellites into geostationary orbit or deep space missions. Very few states have those, and even the number of states with any launch capabilities are fairly small as well. We're still only looking at 9 or so, and some people like to include New Zealand in the launcher state, but this is where counting becomes difficult because it's an American company based in New Zealand. But it shows slightly more diverse launch options for the United States, at least. The number of exclusively military or intelligence or government communication satellites is still pretty small. Many states rely on shared international or commercial satellites for a lot of communications, but there's a lot of states with perhaps 1 or 2 sort of sovereign communication satellites. Very few have a large constellation of them. Things like soft kill anti-satellite weapon systems like jamming and cyber warfare, they are more proliferated. More states can access those because they tend to be cheaper and within the means of smaller or less wealthy states compared to kinetic kill systems or lasers, for example, or at least lethal lasers anyway. So things like electronic warfare are very difficult to measure because it's a very highly proliferated capability, very secretive as well, and it's a fairly crude and simple method of harassing satellite operations as well. So hopefully that still tells you how space can be seen in a more multipolar way, given that certain strategically essential technologies have spread to around 4 to 5 states, or in the case of Europe, a bloc loosely defined. And there are many ways to get what you need from essential space services that doesn't necessarily have to involve the United States or Russia. So it's worth knowing that when we are looking at the balance of power, that space is taken into account in the same way that people take sea power and air power into account. And in the broadest sense as well, military and economic power have to be seen as instruments of political power, as well, as E.H. Carr wrote earlier in the 20th century. It's also worth bearing in mind that the major space powers are also nuclear powers as well, and the thermonuclear revolution still exists. People ask, is there going to be a space war? My response is there going to be a war? Is there going to be a major war between the major powers? And that also then invokes the spectre of nuclear war and nuclear annihilation. So any war in space will happen in that larger terrestrial context, including the thermonuclear context. And wherever there is power, there is resistance, as Foucault argues. There is always a way to resist power. You may not win, you may not succeed, but there are ways to resist. And one of the things about studying war is that it's a study of perpetual upsets, of Davids versus Goliaths, of many larger, stronger powers thinking that they can easily win something, but it turns out the weaker adversary has found ways to cause them no end of problems, even if it's just to bargain for a better peace and a more tolerable defeat. There is always options for resisting space power. Controlling space does not give you control of the world. So space happens in space warfare, and space power is happening in a political universe. There's no political vacuum in space. We go to space and we put machines in space for ultimately political purposes, and so will space warfare be waged for political purposes as well. And this leads into my field of specialism, which is space power theory, questioning what is the role of space power in warfare and strategy and international relations, and what can we learn from past experiences on warfare and how do they apply to outer space. And it helps answer questions such as these on the screen. And many people are already have been writing on this for many, many years. And they draw from past experiences such as Napoleon and Douay, who tend to make many promises about if you command this medium, then you will win the war. Fairly sort of simplistic, mechanistic thinking. And that language is very common in space. Lyndon Baines Johnson and John F. Kennedy made such arguments about if you control space, you control the world. And a modern interpretation of that is the work of Everett Dolman there in his book Astropolitik, which is definitely worth the read and worth engaging with, who applied geopolitical logic to outer space, or the logic of geopolitik to outer space, and said that whoever controls low Earth orbit controls near Earth space. Whoever controls near Earth space dominates terror. Whoever dominates terror then determines the destiny of humankind. So it's about using space to control the world. And a lot of my work is based on salvaging what I think works from those theories and then criticizing the more dominating logic that's within those, because there is always a power to resist any attempts at dominating Earth from space, as there are in dominating any part of the world throughout military and strategic history. So the book really is about presenting a new space power theory to try and give people concepts and a discussion that helps them think better about the role of space warfare in strategic calculations and war planning. It's not to give anyone any strict doctrines or dogmatic answers to questions. It's about giving people the concepts and ideas that helps them come to better answers for whatever situation that they are facing. And the theory has to be useful to anyone in any scenario at any time looking at the role of space technology in warfare and grand strategy. And what I have got are 7 propositions that hopefully improve the quality of thinking, but don't provide simple answers, ideally. So I start off by saying, as I've just been arguing, that space warfare is waged for the command of space, and that command of space has to meet political objectives. So this is a very Clausewitzian point. It's Clausewitz in orbit, effectively. War is a political activity, and whatever you do has to meet political objectives. And any act of violence or aggression in space has to make a difference for who can influence the command of space, who can control or deny the use of space infrastructure to meet the objectives of the war at hand. If disputing or controlling the command of space makes no difference to the outcome of the war, then is there any purpose for space warfare? Not really. So there has to be some strategic output for meeting the political objectives of the war for space warfare. There's no point destroying satellites just for the sake of it. There has to be some utility behind it. And that then, and also the political restrictions on a war also will put political restrictions on satellites. If you're going after GPS, for example, you will have systemic societal consequences and civilian casualties as a result, not just military consequences, for example. So how serious is the war? How much do you want to win this war? How valuable is your political objective in a war? That will help outline what options are available to you in space warfare as well. Some wars, you might be fine in launching a nuclear detonation in space. In other wars, you may not be. That might be too much, too aggressive, and might make things worse, politically speaking. So space warfare has to be waged for a purpose. Second, and again, building on a point I made earlier, space power is really about infrastructure and is connected to Earth. Space is its own unique environment. It needs space specialists. It's not the same as the sea and the air, even though politically and strategically, it is also subject to politics and strategy like the sea and the air. But space is its own unique environment, needs its own specialists, but those specialists have to be able to communicate to everyone else on Earth, or to generalists or to decision makers who may not understand or know enough about space. You need people in military services who can outline how space power can help make a difference to a naval commander or an aerial assault or to ground forces. They won't know, but they need space specialists to communicate that to them. But the space specialists need to know what the terrestrial military forces or the political decision makers need. They have to be relevant to them as well. So we can't have space cadets getting lost in their own fantasies about space lasers or moon colonies or anything like that. They have to make themselves relevant to Earth because that's where their money comes from. But people on Earth need, terrestrial military services and leaders need to know what space can do for them in return. So it's the generalist versus specialist debate with space, essentially. Third, again, which I briefly mentioned earlier, the command of space does not equate to the command of Earth. And whilst this can vary a lot in practice, universally, there is nothing inherent about controlling Earth orbit that means that you will win a war. The United States has had no end of difficulties in Afghanistan and Iraq over the last couple of decades, even though it was never contested in outer space. So whilst space can be really, really important and depending on the circumstances could have a large impact on your ability to wage a conflict, it doesn't automatically decide the victors in a war. Even in a Taiwan war scenario, for example, between America and China, or the NATO bloc versus Russia, what space does matters on the particular scenario at hand. And if you do lose specific space services, it doesn't mean that you've lost everything. Or if you manage to deny space to the adversary, it doesn't mean the adversary is suddenly powerless. They may have more problems, but what that means is specific to the circumstance. It's not a universal truth that you have to control space to win the war. That's too simplistic a way to view the role of space support in warfare. There are always ways to adapt, to resist, and to find alternatives, or just to do what the enemy doesn't expect. The command of space manipulates celestial lines of communication. Space is important in that it transmits information through lines of communication, and also satellites travel through fairly predictable orbits as well, and there are common routes of traffic. And this proposition really is about helping states and actors to determine where might they want to concentrate their efforts in terms of space warfare on particular choke points. So you can start to map different parts of space based on the attractiveness of different kinds of orbits for different kinds of services, common routes of travel, lucrative positions in space, and you can start building choke points in areas of high value in space and areas that you might want to control. So you have to be targeted in the way you want to command space as well. You don't just dominate all of space at all times. You have to target it in the same way with air dominance and sea dominance as well. It's very targeted, fairly precise, and also for specific amounts of time as well. It's not a simple you dominate space or you don't. It's shades of grey. It's about degree of command. Fifth is where I outline my analogy for understanding space power, and that is as a coastline. And this means that you don't need to do stuff in space in order to have influence in space. Earth-based anti-satellite weapon systems are spreading, and they are turning Earth orbit into a hostile coastline. And satellites in space are to varying degrees vulnerable to offensive operations from Earth as well. Also, the coastline of Earth orbit is a secondary environment to terrestrial theaters as well. And no matter what your military organization does in terms of space power risks being something of an afterthought or a useful additional capability rather than something perhaps that is treated with the importance that it deserves. Because like continental powers treated the oceans, they're more focused on land threats, not naval threats. So India, for example, will always be more preoccupied with the Pakistani and Chinese threats as opposed to threats from the Indian Ocean. And the Indian Navy, therefore, is always fighting the Army and the Air Force for what it thinks is a fair share of the defense budget. The same is true for space. How does now the United States Space Force or the space elements within other military forces around the world, how do they fight for resources when people don't see what goes on in space? People see the threats that are on Earth, the missiles, the tanks, the airplanes, the troops that are on Earth. They don't see a satellite in space as inherently dangerous. And also, you're not going to get any footage for the news of a satellite being blown up or somebody hacking into bits of code in a control station. Whereas aerial warfare shows lots of interesting and exciting stuff for the news. And we've seen that being broadcast all over the place in the Nagorno-Karabakh war. Recently, for example, about tanks being blown up. Those things get the news. Space warfare will not get the news in the same way that economic warfare received doesn't really make the news, because it's about influencing the economy and spreadsheets and nothing else. So space warfare will have a visibility problem because it's a secondary environment and more of a coastline where the effects are more esoteric and they're not as spectacular as the primary theaters of war are. So that then leads into the sixth proposition, which is that space power exists in that geocentric mindset, because space powers today are like continental naval powers. There is no truly space-based space power today. All of today's space powers are terrestrial states. They are Earth states, Earth powers that use outer space as an adjunct, as a flanking medium, as a place to get support. It's not like island sea powers that have to do everything by the sea. Terrestrial powers can have other ways to deliver effects to their adversaries, especially if they live next door. How important are space communications if you are a small state in the Baltics facing off against the Russians? Not necessarily. You can have a lot of alternatives and other methods of resisting potential Russian aggression on the ground and in the air and in coastal forces, rather than investing in big space infrastructures. Especially if your budget is very limited. So space power exists in a terrestrial mindset. There'll be terrestrial priorities, and space will also then have to meet the needs of that geocentric mindset, because we aren't a spacefaring civilization as a single species. No state is truly based on the resources of outer space. Space is useful, but it is not essential for existence at the moment. We don't rely on space for raw materials or food or energy, you know, with exception to the sun, of course, ultimately, but that is beyond the scope of sort of more practical strategic thinking. And then finally, in terms of the hard edge, the so what of space technology for modern warfare, space technologies impose dispersion on Earth. So military forces that can use satellites are more networked, they are more dispersed, they can also produce precision warfare effects on the enemy, which makes the enemy disperse as well, to scatter, to avoid being hit by a salvo of precision munitions. So space power is imposing a dispersing effect and increasing the size of the battlefield, in line with other trends in artillery and precise warfare from the Napoleonic era. So a continuing trend of dispersal is what space power is doing for modern warfare, and therefore, if you're able to attack space systems, you are attacking the ability of the enemy to impose dispersion on you, and for them to be able to remain coordinated whilst they have been dispersed as well. Happy to go into any of those in the questions. I know I'm running out of time. So the EU, ESA, NATO. So my thoughts on where does space power leave European geopolitics, if I can get this to work. There we go. So as I mentioned earlier, the EU is becoming a more significant hard power actor in space. Systems like Galileo, Copernicus, the start of the sort of initial tenders on the program for GovSatcom, government satellite communications, MUSIS, the agreement between a few European states to share space-based intelligence, and the initial space surveillance and tracking program of the EU. These are all dual-use systems. So even though they might be civilian controlled and mostly civilian orientated, they have very clear security and military implications and applications as well. So it is providing an emergent military backbone for European Union member states. That is an alternative and a backup for American systems as well, because most European states, especially those before 1991, but now most European states after 1991, have become dependent on the United States through NATO for most space support services. But the European Union now is providing more alternatives of its own. NATO, meanwhile, has no direct assets. It's providing more of a coordinating role, making the individual assets in space of its member states more interoperable, so that you can plug into a German intelligence satellite as easily, hopefully, as you could with a French one, that you can get bandwidth from French communications or Italian communication satellites or the British as you need them. So NATO is still important in coordinating the assets of individual member states, but it has no direct assets of itself in space, unlike the European Union. It's worth remembering that the European Space Agency then is separate to the European Union, but the European Union is the single biggest contributor to ESA revenues. The ESA is the main operational agent and contractor for the European Union space programme. That's muddies the waters in terms of how much influence the EU has, along with certain member states as well within ESA. But ESA is still pretty much mostly about science and commerce and industry, rather than security and defence, as the European Union is more investing more in. However, the EU has noted its intent to create a EU agency for the space programme, which many see as a potential institutional threat to the European Space Agency in terms of taking away work from the European Space Agency. But this is very much early days, and some member states aren't particularly keen on that, but some are. So we'll have to see what happens during the next EU space programme of 2021-2027 and that funding packages to see where does the EU want its money to go, and where does the European Space Agency and its governance mechanisms fit into that larger perspective as well. So there's a lot of potential for institutional changes and political relationships in European space over the next few years. And ESA has always been concerned about a potential EU space agency since the Maastricht Treaty of 1992. So what we're seeing now is perhaps a realization of a long-term fear that the European Space Agency as an institution may have had. So we will see what happens over the next 10 years or so. And then finally, what about small states? What hopefully this presentation has shown is that there is more forum shopping potential for small states than ever before, with more bigger states wanting more customers and more clients and more investments. Smaller states can do more in space. The incrementally decreased cost of access to space is also making it easier. And that's mainly come through miniaturization of information technologies and sensors on satellites, which means smaller satellites are more capable. And there's a lot of sectors in space that small states can invest in, downstream applications, component manufacturing, for example. You don't need a massive complex space program to be significant in space or to do something in space. Ireland, Finland, for example, are good examples of small countries doing stuff in space, so they're already existing examples to look at. There's a lot of potential for doing very specific parts on joint exploration and science initiatives, which the European Space Agency excels at. And larger alliances provide that enabling infrastructure that is beyond the means of small states, but allows smaller states to plug and play effectively and find their way into larger infrastructures. And then on the military side, small states always have, with enough thinking and enough planning, ways to counter the space capabilities of larger states and adversaries as well. So there are always ways to counter the technological systems that larger states put up. So this would be more useful perhaps for the Q&A. I'm happy for the Institute to share these slides in PDF form afterwards as well. But I've spoken for far too long, and I thank you all very much for listening, and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bowen, for the excellent and comprehensive presentation. You've really given us a comprehensive insight into geopolitical aspects of space and the use of space also for strategic competition among great powers as well as small states as well, especially going into the future. You raised a lot of issues concerning the increasing distribution of power in the space domain, with new actors, new competitors entering the space security market, if I can frame it that way. You also raised the issue of how space is operating basically like a cosmic coastline for the countries of the Earth, suited for strategic maneuvers. However, you also raised the limits of space power and the limits of the use of space, meaning that fundamentally strategic competition as well as war itself would be likely still decided mostly on what happens on the ground, on the territorial domain, or maybe the aerial domain, and space and space assets, space tools. They are mostly, at the time being at least, enabling Earth ground forces or aerial forces, naval forces to project better their power, their kinetic power. In light of all these, we have several questions from our audience. I would raise one of them. In light of the theory of space power outlined, does international cooperation in these fields, such as the development of common infrastructure between the Visegrad 4 countries, make sense? So just to give a little bit of regional perspective, does V4 cooperation have any added input, would have any input to space power and developing new space security capabilities?
Thanks. That's a good question. I'll caveat this with by saying I know very little about the details of the Visegrad group and the politics within the Visegrad group, and also ongoing investments either. But I guess sort of the general sort of questions I would have to that would be, well, would those four be able to put in enough sufficient resources for any significant space infrastructure that they can't do themselves, but that also would it be more politically easier to do than if you cooperated through existing alliance structures, where is that diplomatic and economic, are those resources better spent through the European Union or through NATO, or even perhaps bilaterally with just the United States? So an example could be, say, there's an interest in geostationary satellite communications for secure communications for the military, the government, and the intelligence agencies. The United States has had the AEHF, Advanced Extremely High Frequency Satellite, and also the WGS, the Wideband Global Satcom satellites. And those have been designed to have allies buy into those programs, a bit like the F-35 program. So, so on AEHF, a consortium of allies developed that together and invested in it together. With Wideband Global Satcom, Australia has just bought an extra WGS satellite for the constellation from the Americans, which is mostly reserved for Australian channels. So any sort of Visegrad cooperation, I say, would have to would have to compete with those alternatives. So depending on the exact system, there might be some specific technologies that might be better done through Visegrad. So I guess it would matter on what kind of space systems, but on any large space-based system as opposed to ground infrastructure, you might be better off looking at it from either bilaterally with the United States or through alliance structures or through the European Union.
We have a corresponding question, actually, if we look into the broader perspective of how NATO and transatlantic relations will develop also on the military and military capability side. Do you think the EU's space policy in the long run aims to reduce its dependence to US military power, especially here, of course, US space power? And can we say that space power will cause security dilemmas among major powers if we also take into account the other larger powers with space, more and more significant space capabilities?
Yeah, that's a good question. So in terms of the EU, all its investments in space are pushed in terms of autonomy for the EU, but also autonomy for its member states in political, military, and industrial terms. And one of the driving forces of these large EU projects is to maintain a European industrial base in high technology manufacturing and a European military industrial complex, because they don't want to be totally dependent on the United States. There is a lot of integration between the United States, or North America, I should say, to include Canada, and Europe, broadly defined, but there was always that desire, especially in France, but also in other European countries, to not be totally dependent on the United States. So it's a degree of autonomy because the United States is still involved in European security and defence. So, and to make sure that European high-tech industry and space industry does not get hollowed out by the larger and in many ways more capable American one, and of course more privately richer one as well, when you have people like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos who can throw tens of billions at things, where I don't think there's any sort of European equivalent to a space baron, not yet anyway. So there is that autonomy interest there, absolutely, and it's part of larger autonomy interests as well, like in air mobility, for example. The A400M example is really good in terms of saying we don't want to be reliant on the US military industrial complex for this essential capability. Although I know there's a lot of debate around A400M. So I would say it's just part of the larger European autonomy, but it's not going to be total. What is good as well, though, is, and the United States has recognized this now, is that it's not in competition with the United States. They are providing alternatives and backups to the United States as well. And even though the United States and the EU were at loggerheads in 2003 over the Galileo program, they did find compromises. And now the United States has put in its strategy documents, we need Galileo as a backup for military navigation services for GPS. So the United States will be negotiating with the Commission on access to the PRS service in Galileo. And I hope Britain does negotiate that as well. Makes no sense not to do that. In terms of the security dilemma, I don't know, I'd have trouble separating space from the larger terrestrial political, military, economic relationships. Space is a reflection of terrestrial relationships, so I wouldn't put anything specific on space. So expanding more military services and data gathering from space is normal now. We've been doing it for decades, and any major military power has been doing it for a while. So it's more about modernization and expanding normalized military and intelligence activity. So there's nothing really alarming about it, other than the general concerns that always comes with different countries modernizing their military forces or expanding in certain areas. Space weapons is usually talked about in terms of security dilemma, but they are part of a larger military picture. Then even space-based weapons, they're not going to transform the strategic picture overnight, and they're still really, really expensive to do for limited application, really. So it's more of a political question than a technological question. China and America could always change their relations overnight, depending on the next president of the United States, of course, who knows. But even with, if there's another 4 years of Trump, I mean, Trump could have a sudden change of heart. You never know. So it's more of a political question and interpreting things rather than, say, space technologies have this effect. It's always, a question of psychology, interpretation, and prevailing terrestrial geopolitical headwinds.
Thank you. Remaining at the EU level, if you could elaborate a little bit more on the relationship between EU and ESA, and where do you think the relationship will or should go? So how could you a little bit elaborate your opinion on that?
The honest and short question is, I don't know. This is a very sensitive area in European astropolitics at the moment, and there's not a lot of information coming out about the opinions of various member states of either the EU or ESA about what would they prefer to happen, or what do they think about all this. We know that the Director General of ESA has been on record saying that this is not a threat to the European Space Agency. We look forward to a healthy relationship and all the usual sort of language. And at the moment, I mean, I'm in the same boat as everyone else, just watching it to see what happens, and what competencies does the EU give to what comes out to the GSA, the European GNSS agency, that they're going to turn into the EU agency for the space program. But they should just call it the EU Space Agency, because everybody's already confused about which agency is doing what. But yeah, the direction of travel is the concerning one, because even though the language at the moment is positive for the European Space Agency, and it might be taking more, I would imagine that an EU space agency would begin by taking more operational control of EU-funded space projects. So it's already doing that for Galileo. That's controlled by Galileo. Copernicus is a bit more complicated. I struggle to understand the responsibilities in terms of everyday operations and data sharing with Copernicus, because it's such an overlap of ESA and the EU. I think day to day, I think ESA is still very influential, and it's ESA staff that operate a lot of Copernicus satellites, like the Sentinels, I think. But I would imagine things like that might be transferred to the EU at some point. This is pure speculation at this point. There's been nothing to suggest that. That would just be, this is me just thinking naturally what might become an EU space agency. So that may not be the case, I don't know. But that's just me speculating at this time. But there's just so little information about this at the moment. We just have to wait and see what happens. But it would be a realization of a threat to the European Space Agency that they've been afraid of since 1992. And the European Space Agency doesn't want itself to be seen as part of the defense sector or security. And there was a lot of debate and discussion about the S in GMES, because Copernicus used to be called Global Monitoring for Environment and Security, and there was a lot of diplomatic fighting over the security in GMES because of the military applications of such high quality Earth observation technologies. So we'll see whether the EU becomes a more obvious security and defense space actor, whilst ESA might remain space science, coordinating universities across its members, industrial participation and contracts for maybe more ostensibly civilian science and engineering projects in space. But yeah, who knows? There's so little information to go on here if like me, you're not actually involved in the politics of it. So yeah, I mean, I've got my popcorn ready to see how it turns out over the next 10 years.
Shifting our attention a little bit back to the theoretical side, how would you evaluate the value of space from a military angle? Does it favor more the offensive side, the offensive capabilities, or more so as a defensive space or defensive tools? So which side do you see space as more useful?
Neither. The answer is purely contextual. It's based on the scenario at hand, really. So in the final chapter of the book, I apply the theory towards a Taiwan war scenario and try and think out what are the pressures on all sides of conflict, including Taiwan, which is often overlooked in English language publications on a China-America war over Taiwan. When would they want to attack space systems? When do they want to deny the use of space? When do they want to challenge the dispersing influence of space technology on modern warfare? And there are many grounds for attacking space systems early on in the conflict, but there are also possibilities and opportunities for holding on to engaging in space warfare, at least the very destructive version of space warfare, until a critical moment is reached in the terrestrial campaign. So it might be better for China to attack all of America's relevant space systems when the naval task force is approaching Taiwan, as opposed to when they're all dispersed across the Asia-Pacific theatre at the outset of a conflict, especially when, give them a few weeks, they might have adapted to the loss of those space systems. So satellites are vulnerable, so there are many options for attacking them, but none of them are guaranteed to work, with exception to hard kill, depending if you've got the right sort of missiles, and if you've got enough of them. In terms of the defensive side, the United States space holdings and assets are so vast and massive that you really have to start attacking lots of different systems and infrastructure if you want to start really taking away most of America's space systems. So, we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of satellites here with different kinds of operating systems, infrastructures, communications terminals, and then its allies as well. So in terms of Chinese space warfare targeting, they've got their work cut out as to which American systems and allied systems do you need to take out to make the biggest difference on Earth. So the fears of a space Pearl Harbor, which, they're not baseless, it'll be very difficult to achieve. So not impossible, but difficult, because you have to take out a very large empire in space, effectively, all these satellites doing all these different things. So the defensive is still very important in space through resiliency and redundancy and alternatives as well. So, or deterrence by denial is how many Americans would call it, by making an attack on space systems strategically meaningless if you've got loads of alternatives to fall back on. So, but then the situation is different again for NATO and Russia, when the NATO alliance has a lot more terrestrial defensive advantages compared to the United States projecting power onto Taiwan.
There is one area which we only briefly covered yet, and that is rules and international law. We do have some international conventions regulating space and the use of space, and well, one of them actually refers to on the non-use of space for military purposes. So basically a prohibition of use of space itself for warfare. But looking at your slides and hearing your presentation, one has a sense that these are just papers without real implications or effects. So how do you see the role of international law regulations influencing the developments, either capability developments or in terms of strategy going forward? And what do you see as the most important areas where great powers as well as all the countries should come together and refresh international regulations on the topic?
That's a big question. It is a good question, a big one. So I won't be able to do justice to it, I don't think. So the Outer Space Treaty of 1967 is always lauded as one of the most successful treaties ever signed. And yeah, it's true. It's a very popular treaty, been signed and ratified by almost every state. But one of the reasons for its success is that it allowed its signatories to do what they wanted to do anyway in outer space, which was to continue to use Earth orbit for infrastructural purposes, for economic, for war development and prestige. It made no curbs on the Soviets and the Americans' ability to develop military space systems. It only outlawed the placement of nuclear weapons in orbit, or weapons of mass destruction, I should say. It doesn't actually say nuclear weapons, but WMDs, which are never defined, but commonly understood to mean chemical, biological, nuclear and radiological. But beyond that, yeah, anything goes, really, and everything else becomes a complaint about the spirit of the treaty, which breaking the spirit of international treaty is just happens all the time. Sometimes some states break the word of it, the actual language of a treaty as well, funnily enough. But in terms of getting sort of more curbs on military activities in space, you will not get states to relinquish the possibility of attacking space systems with Earth-based methods, whether it's ground-based missiles, electronic warfare, or cyber intrusions, getting into the computer network systems, or even laser dazzling, because those technologies are highly proliferated, very difficult to control and verify their non-use against satellites, because well, if a war happens and you have those systems lying around, well, you're pretty well going to use them if they're useful. And who's going to stop you in a time of war? And will you care about international law if it makes a difference? But there are, and as long as states continue to want to use satellites for military purposes, the specter of space warfare will continue. So, and that's been, you know, the space has been a militarized realm since the dawn of the space age. V2s were the first things to go into outer space, you know, missiles. If it wasn't for the ability of long-range rockets to deliver nuclear weapons and to deploy spy and communication satellites for the military, the Soviets and the Americans would never have poured that much money into these temperamental rocket technologies, you know, that kept failing in the 1950s and 1960s. So as long as you continue using space for military purposes at all, and economic purposes, then the rationale to engage in space warfare will be there, and major states will not want to explicitly outlaw any actions. And in existing space international law, Article 51 of the UN Charter still applies to space, the right to self-defense. So that is the sort of the legalistic get out of jail card for anyone looking at attacking space systems. Well, self-defense. So it's that old argument. So, you know, in that sense, space is not different at all to other areas of terrestrial activity in terms of trying to outlaw military and aggressive behavior. So, you know, which is dispiriting for a lot of people. But there are targeted areas where I think some achievements could be made. So, you know, we've already outlawed nuclear testing in space, for example, you know, so going back to 1963. Test bans on weapon systems could be looked at. So trying to get a moratorium on kinetic weapons test bans in space, certain flight tests possibly, because you can monitor and track those activities and attribute them as well. So those things are possible too. Norms, yeah, they can come about if everyone agrees to them, but that is the difficulty. So not impossible, but previous attempts at norm building have erroneously tried to regulate military behavior when a lot of interest was really in trying to regulate everyday benign behavior, so that if two satellites get too close to each other, who has the right of way? So issues like space traffic management or better governing the International Telecommunications Union, there's a lot of work to be done there on perhaps laws or even just norms or ways of global governance in space that really need to be done without touching the military realm. Because once you start getting into the military side, everyone just closes the doors because they want absolute freedom in the military realm. And that is one of the reasons why the European Union Code of Conduct effort failed in 2014, because it tried to regulate military behavior. And then the Russians and the Chinese were saying, why don't you sign our space treaty instead? Because that will give security for all. And of course, that has loads of its own problems as well. So I think there's a lot of work that could be done on the civilian commercial regulations and space traffic management and global governance, but it has to stay away from trying to curb the freedoms of militaries in space, in the same way that military vessels at sea have a lot of immunities to international laws of the sea.
Approaching the final minutes of our discussion, and to head on to wrapping up the webinar and shifting ourselves back again to the more practical capability side of space power. Where do you see NATO going forward? Could it move beyond coordination in developing new capabilities, such as, for instance, the AWACS systems within NATO? And where do you see the UK's position within NATO, and also possibly UK cooperating with Visegrad in certain areas, or other smaller NATO or EU member states going forward? So if you could just summarize your last thoughts based on these questions.
Yeah, so NATO's direction of travel is interesting. So last year it declared space an operational domain after first talking about it 10 years before, so it took a long time to get to that point, but better late than never, I suppose. And NATO used to have 1 or 2 satellites back in the 1980s, if I remember correctly. I'm sure somebody in the audience will know all about that. Yeah, it's the same to the Visegrad question, really, in terms of, you know, any platforms based on NATO. Is there's a path dependency already there in terms of developing collaborative platforms through ESA, through the EU, bilaterally, and you know, through, you know, on a sovereign basis as well. And with a lot of these military space capabilities, they're also very sensitive in terms of intelligence provisions as well. And it means a lot of European member states prefer to do it on a sovereign basis, build a system first, and then figure out how can we share our system with some states not having a fully joint platform. Any joint platform for NATO will be competing with European Union drives here as well. And the European Union has a massive lead over NATO here because it's already done big projects and is already in the process of sorting out how to have militarily sensitive space technologies shared among 27 now member states. So yeah, 27, I can't remember. Anyway, ignore the Brits. We're not relevant anymore to the EU. So so that path dependencies with a NATO, is it better off focusing on interoperability, because there's still a lot of member states in NATO who have sovereign assets, how to make those work better together for individual states. So I think NATO is definitely very important there. I think you need a very compelling economic and political reason for NATO to develop its own space-based assets because of the sheer expense of doing so, and the path dependencies on other ways of doing space-based systems on a European level already. Same goes for the Visegrad and the UK. I mean, if there are areas of mutual benefit, absolutely, there's no reason why. It's a matter of political will and whether each party thinks it's getting what it wants out of it, and, you know, are they getting out of it what resources they've put in. And, you know, the UK you know, is doing a lot more in space now than it has previously. It's got a large small satellite sort of research and development and manufacturing capability, and, you know, it's looking at small satellite launch capabilities, which hopefully will be online in the next 5 years perhaps. So and it already has connections with larger aerospace companies as well. Companies like Iridium, for example, are based in the UK, and the UK has a lot of experience in modernizing terrestrial military forces with space systems as well, especially as one of the most integrated partners of the United States too. So the UK has a lot of roles to play, both in terms of industrial cooperation and joint projects, but also in terms of modernizing military forces to better integrate on a NATO and alliance level with the United States and other allied space systems as well, like inter-officer exchanges and things like that. So it's about having those specialists understand what are our gaps and who can help us fill these gaps in a mutually beneficial way. So I'm sure there are those gaps available, but that goes into a level of detail that's beyond my knowledge of the Visegrad group. Sorry.
Thank you. Well, great concluding remarks, and you certainly gave us a lot of food for thought and inspiring ideas going forward in how to move cooperation among EU members, NATO members forward, not just within a Visegrad setting, but jointly together, and of course with participation with the UK despite its leaving from the European Union. I do thank you very much for your really rich, valuable talk and contribution to our program. I would like to also thank all of our participants for joining us and for their activity, for their active contribution with their questions to our program. I would encourage everyone to stay tuned on our website. This program will be on our YouTube channel in a couple of days, so it could be accessed anytime through our website. and please follow our programs for the future. And I apologize again for the technical difficulties. I hope this didn't take away any of the value of the excellent program. So thank you again, especially to Dr. Bowen. I hope we can sometime either in this form, online form, or in other forms would be able to continue on with the discussion and with the debates on space power and the geopolitical implications of our final frontier. So thank you again to you all. I wish you a great day.
Thank you very much.